Good morning. Remembering a genius. Former Apple CEO Steve Jobs, the man behind the most revolutionary inventions of the digital age, has died of cancer at the age of 56. From the Mac to the iPod, his products literally changed the way we live. We'll celebrate his life, his vision, and his impact on the world today, Thursday, October 6, 2011.
ABC News. This is a special edition of Today, the Death of Steve Jobs, with Matt Lauer and Ann Curry, live from Studio 1A in Rockefeller Plaza.
And welcome to Today on this Thursday morning. I'm Ann Curry.
And I'm Matt Lauer. Because Steve Jobs was a guy who touched our lives in so many ways, reaction to his death has been pouring in from all around the world overnight. A makeshift memorial is now in place outside of Apple's headquarters. That's in Cupertino, California, following the sad death of that company's founder and visionary, Steve Jobs. If you look this morning simply at the apple.com on my iPad here, you will see a simple tribute to Jobs, a black and white photo with the dates that he was born and he died.
Because it's hard to overstate the impact that he had on all of our lives. I mean, he never graduated from college.
Right.
And yet who doesn't have at least an iPod or an iPad or an iPhone or a personal computer?
You know, I think obviously this did not come as a shock to people because we had watched his health deteriorate over the years since he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He appeared very frail in recent months, but still, when it finally happens, you stop and you really take notice.
No question, you know. He also, in a commencement address to Stanford University in 2005, he had something really pretty wonderful to say. He said, "Remembering that you're going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose." And he added, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life."
As I mentioned, tributes immediately poured in as the news of his death spread. President Obama released a statement saying, in part, "There may be no greater tribute to Steve's success than the fact that much of the world learned of his passing on a device that he invented."
And Bill Gates, Jobs' one-time rival and co-founder of Microsoft, had this to say: "The world rarely sees someone who has had the profound impact Steve has had, the effects of which will be felt for many generations to come." And then there's this from Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, who said, "Thanks for showing that what you build can change the world."
Let us get right to NBC's George Lewis. He's at Apple's headquarters in Cupertino, California. George, good morning to you.
Good morning, Matt. This is a very sad day for Apple's 47,000 employees worldwide. They're mourning Steve Jobs, a man who dropped out of college and had no formal schooling in computer engineering, but figured out a way to make tech sexy and transformed Apple into the world's most valuable company. He was a college dropout who co-founded Apple Computer in 1976, and within a few years became fabulously wealthy.
He's kind of a regular guy who started in his garage with this idea with a friend and built this thing into this multi-billion-dollar business.
His secret, wow the consumers with cool designs and ease of use.
When it comes to consumer computer users, the computer industry hasn't done a really good job of trying to understand them and understand their desires and their needs.
So in 1984, he introduced the Macintosh, calling it insanely great. There was a famous Super Bowl ad for the Mac, running only once on TV, but seen millions of times on YouTube.
We shall prevail.
Apple didn't always prevail. Faced with tough competition, the company struggled trying to gain a share of the personal computer market. And Steve Jobs had an abrasive personality that contributed to his ouster from Apple in 1985.
There's the brilliant, genius, visionary side of him that burned very, very bright, and there was this terrible dark side to him, too.
He went into the movie business, acquiring Pixar Studios in 1986, making a string of hit computer animated films, starting with Toy Story.
To infinity and beyond!
Then, after an 11-year absence, he was brought back to Apple, where his creativity revitalized the company. The iPod changed the way people listen to their music.
Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
And across the country, there were long lines for the first iPhones in 2007. Then, 3 years later, they lined up for the iPad, changing the way people consume media.
Most of the great ideas, when you see them, you go, of course.
But while he was brimming with great ideas, Steve Jobs was battling declining health. He was operated on for pancreatic cancer in 2004. A year later, he spoke about that in a commencement address at Stanford University.
This was the closest I've been to facing death, and I hope it's the closest I get for a few more decades. And yet, death is the destination we all share.
Then in 2009, he underwent a liver transplant.
I now have the liver of a mid-20s person who died in a car crash and was generous enough to donate their organs.
On August 24th of this year, Jobs stepped down as Apple CEO. 6 years earlier, he had this bit of advice for the Stanford grads.
Have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become.
He was a man who followed his heart and intuition to become one of Silicon Valley's great visionaries. Steve Jobs leaves behind a wife and 4 children. And a statement from the Jobs family says Steve died peacefully, surrounded by people he loved. Ann?
George Lewis, thank you. Steve Wozniak was there at the beginning, co-founding Apple alongside Steve Jobs in a Silicon Valley garage. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
We're going to show you that photo of the two of you. It's pretty famous now, the two of you building at the beginning the first Apple computer. What do you want to say about the man you once knew?
Well, it's very difficult for me. We knew that he was in poor health, and it was kind of like when my father died and knew it was coming and told us. So when you expect it, it's not. I don't go into a lot of crying that day, but just woke up with so many of these memories of the things we did together. And some of them were just like normal, fun things you do with people. But looking back, so many of them were so important. They were important to the world. And I was kind of like the shy, quiet guy, who had my skills. And Steve was there wanting to change the world and wanting to take devices that could, actually make a start and change people's lives and develop a company. And it was a perfect marriage, if you will.
He once said, I want to put a ding in the universe. What drove him to that, do you think, Steve?
When I met him, and he was quite young, still in high school, it was books that he was reading, and he would always talk about the great people that moved us forward as humans. The Shakespeares, the Isaac Newtons, that the very few that had a very special brain. And because he spoke of them all, he wanted to be one of those people. And he was always looking to somehow be involved in some kind of learning how to lead the world role.
You're saying from the very beginning he was a visionary. At the same time, he was a very private person. What would you say about him personally, his character? What was he like to be around?
And the reason we do this
there's very early days, then there were early Apple days. There are different time frames, and we started out as young kids who would go around and even do a little bit of misbehavior together. These are things that you remember forever, and developing your values and talking about what's important in the world. How should people live? How should they treat each other? How should companies be structured was even one of those topics. And you formulate your ideas of where the world's going. And then as Apple really got started with our great product, the Apple II, that was going to change the world, that's where Steve's role was to learn and be involved in every single department of a company, learn how to run an organization. And he just started having ideas. And whenever we had meetings, this is just, it just bothers me so much. You see all the great products we have today, and everybody recognizes Steve for that. And even I do. He's got such incredible credibility. When he speaks, it's like this is the way that is right in the world. In the earliest days of Apple, it was the same thing. We'd have different ideas of how to develop a product, how to market it, what a packaging should be like, and Steve would come up with ideas that were always better than anyone else's.
At the same time, we understand he was very exacting. He had a kind of a perfectionist streak. What can you tell us about that?
He didn't really have that streak when we were young, when we were starting Apple. It's kind of like he developed it as he, was more and more in a position to think and realize what had worked before and what didn't. And very often, when he found things that worked, it became a very stick very close to it for your entire life, certain principles. And his core principles turned out to be, very good. As far as all the little details, I do not know how he ever functioned and kept that much in his head. Don't know that myself. Steve stayed in the game. He stayed in the game, and he kept driving it, and he stayed at the forefront, and really is the person who has set most of the direction for the world more than anyone in existence. And it's very difficult to imagine, that huge a loss. It's, to me, it was like I just felt dumbstruck. I almost couldn't talk at first because it was like you told me that John Lennon got killed.
I understand that you last saw him, according to the Washington Post, some 3 months ago after he had emerged from a medical leave. How do you think, though, even though you didn't want to pry, facing death defined how he lived his life in those final years?
Well, he actually lived his life, his personal life, very privately. And I think that's, it's very admirable for his family to have been, shielded in a sense. And I think it gave him a lot of flexibility. It's funny because the way Apple developed these great products also involved a lot of secrecy. It gives you a lot of the ability to think things out and do them your way. I know that when he spoke to me, he was such a good father and cared so much about his kids and his relationship and communication with them.
I want to ask you about something that President Obama said. He said, quote, "There may be no greater tribute to Steve's success than the fact that much of the world learned of his passing on a device he invented." Do you think Steve Jobs might smile at that, Steve Wozniak?
I think very much. As a businessman, he doesn't smile as greatly as he did when we were young, but I think that one would tickle his fancy.
All right, Steve Wozniak, thank you so much. And now with more, here's Matt.
All right, Ann, thank you very much. After learning of the death of Steve Jobs, Time magazine literally stopped the presses for the first time in 20 years to redo its latest issue. Here is a first look at the cover that will be on the newsstands tomorrow. We're joined now by Time's managing editor, Rick Stengel, and NBC's Tom Brokaw. Guys, good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Picture of Jobs 1984 with an early Mac. What's the headline of the article? Figuratively and literally.
American Icon. The actual lead article is by Walter Isaacson, a former managing editor of Time, who is now writing the great Steve Jobs biography with Steve's cooperation, and he did a kind of summing up of what Steve represented, what he represented for society, for technology, and how he transformed everything.
Is it appropriate, Tom, to say a sentence like, there will be the Henry Fords, the Thomas Edisons, and the Steve Jobs of the world? Does he fit in that group?
Indisputably. 400 or 500 years from now, maybe even longer than that, they'll look back and Steve Jobs will be one of the defining figures of the technology that has absolutely transformed the world. It's created another universe that we could not have anticipated.
Yeah, I was thinking of an experiment here. You're sitting with a crowd out in our plaza behind us, and if we were to say, and they can hear us right now, how many, raise your hand if you have an iPod, an iPad, an iPhone. I mean, look at that. That's impact in a very real sense, Rick.
It's interesting. He was not an inventor in a traditional sense. He didn't create anything out of nothing that hadn't existed before. He found things that people were doing, and he made them better. He had a passion for improving things so that it seemed that they were transformed.
As a matter of fact, he commented about that. He said he liked to exist at the intersection of art and technology. He loved the cool factor, Tom. He said, what would it be like if everybody in the world drove a beige car? What fun would that be?
Well, we got the first Mac in 1984, and our household, our children were in junior high and in grade school at that time. The second night that we had it, I went down to my office, I woke up, and there was a kid from the building who'd come up the back stairs to play on the Mac, and we just had a steady stream of them. About 2 days later, the new CEO of IBM came to have an editorial board meeting with us here, and I said, what about the Mac? He went,
not going to last.
No, not going to last.
He was a perfectionist. I mean, he would look at a prototype and throw it out and demand another one until he was completely satisfied with the product.
He was a perfectionist. The modern notion was form follows function, but for Steve, form became function. Form defined everything. He was obsessed with every little detail. I actually remember a few months ago when he came originally to show us the iPad, and I mentioned that I'd been to the store on the Upper West Side, And he went into a whole different discussion saying, you know, I got that marble from this quarry in Perugia, and it was from the northwest corner. I wanted a particular kind of marble. He talked about it for 15 minutes. He was an incredible perfectionist.
Let me read you something from the Seattle Times editorial today. It says, quote, "The greatest lesson from Jobs' career is to keep the doors open for people like him."